Thank you so much, Sebastian, the organizers, for these very kind words and this invitation. As you know, I have been invited to step in replacement of Anna Wexler. I encourage you to look up her work. She does very interesting scholarship about translational neuroethics. And before I dive into my talk, I simply wanted to remind everyone to hand back their cards to Floris. And over there. And I hope you enjoyed this talk. And actually, I would credit Aristotle for the science walks, because the school of Aristotle were described as the peripatetician, basically means peripatos, walking around. So they were a walking club before their time, probably recognizing how oxygen and physical activity are cognitive enhancers. So because they were astute observers of facts and human realities. So yeah, thank you for inviting me, and I'm hoping that this this talk will kind of cater to the broader group. Maybe it's going to be easier to follow for those who are invested in ethics, but I'm hoping it's going to reach people in social science also, which is a very important part of this group. And as you will see, yeah, I think things are pretty open-ended, and I'm hoping, again, that we'll have a lot of time for discussion after this talk. So I'll immediately start delivering the talk. And where's the pointer? Thank you. All right. So I want to recognize that the work we do is teamwork, and I'm delighted to be surrounded by a group of motivated young scholars who undertake our work and form a really interesting collegial group to work with. And thank you again for inviting me. And I'll give a bit of foregrounding for the talk, and then I'll have three important messages. But before doing so, I want to unpack a bit the topic of this talk, which is a bit unusual even for myself. So I need to try to make sense of the topic. So you'll hear me talk about imaginations of future well-being. And I want to kind of make the case for the importance of imagination in ethics. I want to make the case for the importance of ethics that focuses on human flourishing. And when ethics does engage with kind of the deeper existential meanings of life, I think it also taps into how we imagine life in its current forms and its future forms. And I think it has importance for cognitive enhancement and discussions about neurotechnology, because they are also bringing about different possibilities, different futures, different possibilities for the future. And when I kind of explore these ideas, I'll be tapping into a forthcoming book I'm publishing at MIT Press, which provides an account of ethics as deliberative wisdom. So it links to this idea of living ethics, of envisioning ethics as a search for wisdom, and wisdom being the knowledge of human flourishing, both theoretical and practical. And the most kind of interesting way to develop this kind of knowledge is to do it through participatory methods, such as deliberation and other forms of engagement. So to move on a bit in this foregrounding, I want to make a few observations about how the discussion about cognitive enhancement has been structured. What are the terms of the debate? And right off the bat, I want to recognize that this is a long debate. So Beyond Therapy, a landmark publication of the President's Council on Bioethics in the US, dates from 2003. And it was a rather divisive publication, because immediately it spurred reactions in academia and policy, featuring people who thought cognitive enhancement is raising really deep, important, disturbing social, ethical problems. We need to address them. And on the other side, you had people kind of really trying to, how could I say this, minimize the importance of these issues, trying to make the case for how, cognitive enhancement use of neurotechnologies was just like tutoring or education or whatever, nothing whatsoever controversial about this. So it's interesting that early on you could see a sharp divide, and this is work I did with Cynthia way back. And so it's interesting that already in those years, the debate seemed to be polarized. And it's not so much a surprise, acknowledging where the debate kind of was initiated in North America, knowing also that even at that time, there was at least, it had been 10 years since the publication by Hunter of the Culture Wars. The culture wars really shaping, the structure of public debate and academic debate in the US. And I think, this was really foreshadowing work because we're realizing now its impact. We're living it. I think, those who live in the US or North America and those outside, we're all influenced by what's happening in the US and what will happen in terms of how the bioethics of technology will be shaped in the future. There could be important changes coming up. So what I want to kind of further claim is I think this polarization has shaped imaginaries. It has shaped how we think and imagine futures, including how neurotechnology fits in terms of broader narratives. You may wonder, well, does this have any consequences, this polarization of public debate? And probably too many to list, in my humble opinion. But one of them that is important to bear in mind for my talk today is I think those kind of polarized imaginaries could colonize our imaginations with rather rigid, dogmatized accounts of different socio-technological imaginaries or realities, such that preset or dominant views do the thinking for us, right? They do the thinking for us instead of us doing the thinking about what we need to do about those technologies in a way that constrain what we imagine to be possible or desirable, okay? So obviously I'm taking a critical standpoint with respect to how things have been kind of shaping up and are likely going to be increasingly be shaped up. That said, I acknowledge there are several factors that are shaping discussions about cognitive enhancement and all other topics in neuroethics. The culture wars is really not the only thing happening. I don't want to overdo the argument. And there are likely several factors that constrain what's important for us, I think, and from a kind of a scholarly and ethical standpoint, open discussion and debate and exploration of ideas. I think there are many factors that constrain that. I think open discourse is disruptive. Okay, so I don't want to kind of dismiss or minimize the impact of how disruptive I think questions and open scholarly debate can be. And so you may wonder, well, is polarization still an issue? And I'm going to pull from Velko's work on brain organoids. He did really good work with his team on print media coverage of brain organoids. And one of his conclusions is that actually the structure of the debate in this context seems, again, to be ripe for breeding more polarization because of a sharp divide between negative and positive reports. So this has been basically a long-standing issue, and we're seeing that even novel technologies are being kind of, I wouldn't say like chewed up in the structure of this debate, in which also academic bioethicists and other scholars are being pulled into, okay? So there was a really interesting talk by Art Kaplan, who was one of our leading bioethicists in North America, about how the academic bioethicist has been rather well aligned with democratic opinions, but at the same time that there are many religious neoconservative groups that have been funded now for several decades and are just ready to take over a lot of the the new Trump administration and play an important role. So I think for us, this is something to keep on the radar screen and appreciate what's happening and why. So what I want to do really, as you'll see in the remainder of the talk, is really ask what we can learn from the nature of discussions on different neurotechnologies, including cognitive enhancement. And you can even broaden this up if you've been involved in ethics of genetics or brain organoids. It'd be wonderful if you share your experience of how you manage or face challenges in opening up debate and grounding ethical questions in realities around you. And I want to further invite us to think about what this structure of the debate reveals about our imagination of well-being. Whose is it, and what shape it takes? And are we actually talking about this very explicitly or only in certain kinds of ways? I'd love to hear you on this. So that's basically my goal today, is kind of open up the conversation. So what I'm going to do, and these are my 3 main points. Say a few words about neuroethics on a more personal note, because as Seb mentioned, I've been involved for around 20 years now in this field, really since the beginning, and make a few observations about how the field has evolved, and to some extent maybe not evolved. Then I want to say a few words about the role of imagination in ethics and relationship to eudaimonia or human flourishing. And then I want to kind of bring this back home to how we envision the future of discussions about neurotechnology or neuroethics. So on a personal note, I think my engagement in the field of neuroethics is likely why Seb reached out to me, because I haven't been publishing so much about cognitive enhancement in the last years. So I acknowledge that there are people here are much more up to pace with current developments. But that being said, being involved in the field makes me realize that neuroethics has very often been equated with an ethics of neurotechnology, right? Neuroethics is an ethics of neurotechnology. And you can see this very early on in the development of the field. There was an early entry in the Encyclopedia of Bioethics by Paul Wolpe, basically stating that neuroethics is a content field, defined by the technologies that it examines rather than any particular philosophical approach. So nothing philosophically novel or different about neuroethics. Simply, neuroethics is an ethics of technologies that intervene in the brain, and the brain being basically the seat of personality or personal identity and executive function, then therefore, this merits dedicated attention in the field as a field of neuroethics. Now, however, there were many other kind of competing ways of thinking and envisioning the field. And this is simply part of a response I was making to a colleague who was basically trying to boil down neuroethics to an ethics of neurotechnology. And I responded saying, no, wait, there are many other ways of envisioning the field. And yes, tackling challenges related to neurotechnology is one of them. But for example, in our work, as Seb was mentioning, we did a lot of work on the public, the structure of public debate, and a lot of work to address ethical questions about specific patient populations in neurology and psychiatry. And this led basically to the development of a form of pragmatic neuroethics, in which my group was really involved in developing. That being said, others imagined the field quite differently. Also, many scholars advanced the idea that we needed a neuroethics to reflect on the evolving interdisciplinary insights about human nature. So, for example, Mike Gazzaniga early on also wrote that neuroethics should be coming up with a brain-based philosophy of life. So a complete contradiction with Wolpe. He was saying there's nothing new philosophically about neuroethics, right? And we have others saying, no, there's a potential here for a new kind of neurophilosophy or neurophilosophical ethics, if you want. So the issue of which neuroethics was being imagined was brought up. For example, Judy Illes and I published an early paper where we discuss how, imaging technologies and imagination were kind of tied up, and how, there was an important role of imagination in the early days of the field. And we got some interesting criticism, including from my former doctoral supervisor, who pointed out that we should be imagining a form of neuroethics that expands beyond gene ethics, that perhaps we were looking at the trees, but we have to also look at the forest and step back. And there has been a kind of a small ongoing debate about, what's the framing of neuroethics and how it's being shaped up by a neurotechnological agenda, yes, no. But in the end, although I kind of always disagreed with this vision, I must acknowledge that neuroethics, I think, has really become an ethics of neurotechnology. I think that vision has prevailed, and I think the new wave of funding by NIH, for example, has really furthered that vision, which has become, not to say the only one, but predominant. But I want to ask basically, whoops, sorry. I think what I want to say, I think that has had implications. I think it has had implication in terms of what we've been attentive to and what we've left on the side. Just to give you a few examples, and I could be the first culprit, right? Because I've been active for like 20 years in the field. And it seems to me that things like, the digital childhood, the impact of technology on childhood and adolescence, on brain development and mental health, has not really been tackled by neuroethics. Disparities in neurological and brain health, we know it's rampant, like the availability of clinical services for neurological conditions and psychiatric conditions, is completely affected by disparities in access to health. You may also think that, this ecological crisis that we're kind of starting to face has to affect our mental health in a sense, or our thinking about mental health should be attentive to what's going on in our broader natural environment. And again, this is something that some of our colleagues have touched upon, but I'd say there are only a few of them, right? But this is a major kind of worldwide crisis. And I think one blatant example that is affecting North America like you wouldn't believe is the opioid crisis. And again, I must say this has not been part much of the agenda. And this crisis is taking lives of thousands of Canadians every year and tens of thousands of Americans every year. So, what is the engagement of neuroethics with these issues, and why they have not been so much on the radar screen? And maybe this is partly explainable by a focus or most fascination with new neurotechnologies. Okay, so the second point I want to make now is so say a few words about ethics and imaginations of well-being. So I have to drink a bit of water because this will be a challenge to explain for me. All right. So given how different views and imaginations of neuroethics have come about, I think it's worth stepping back and asking what role imagination plays in ethics. And I want to share 3 ideas on the relationship between imagination and ethics. And I'll do so by first distinguishing ethics and morality. I'll try to be quick on this. Maybe it's basic, but it plays an important role in what I've been working on in the last years. Then I want to make an additional claim that ethics aims at human flourishing, and that human flourishing taps into imaginative abilities, And imagination, furthermore, taps into memory, episodic memory, to name it. And then I want to conclude this second part by just emphasizing that the exercise of imagination is an ethical, social, and political process, and it's been often restricted in practice. So on the one hand, I'll be claiming it plays an important role, but in practice, imagination is often constrained or colonized in ways that I mentioned early on. So ethics distinct from morality. So we know from Aristotle, who I love very much, that human beings are social and political animals, notably because of their ability to create political communities based on their ability for language. So we know that, and it's an important fact about who we are. Another important fact is that we are quite clever. I would vote for more intelligence, for the better of the world. But we have quite a bit, and in comparison to chimpanzees, our closest cousins, we have quite a bit of additional cognitive abilities explained by our, increase, like greater brain size, notably. So that the fact that we're social animals and we're intelligent social animals, I'm not saying that chimpanzees are dumb, they're very clever, and so as are parrots and other animals. But this intelligence allows the existence of two kinds of cognitive systems in the domain of human morality. So again, that's a very basic distinction, and many of you would explain it much better than I do. So you're probably very familiar with Kahneman and Tversky's work, distinguishing between more automated, implicit cognitive systems on the one hand, and more deliberate, explicit rule-making efforts on the other hand. What I want to argue is basically that human morality is a system one process. So in everyday life, just like other social animals, we are able to get by being compassionate, understanding enough so that we can live together as colleagues, family members, friends. In a way, I mean, I'm not saying it's perfect, but we have enough heuristics to make it work on an everyday basis. Ethics, on the other hand, is really an inquiry into human moralities, and I'll use the plural because I don't think there's a single human morality. I think there are many traditions and cultures, and ethics is maybe an attempt to share and to create a common form of morality or agreements, but this is something that we try to create. I don't think it exists. I think it's something that we aspire to in different forms, human rights and whatever. And so obviously ethics is an intelligent process. It's a process of inquiry. It's a process of doubting, of asking questions. Another way that I kind of image this is human morality is really what grounds us as human beings, because morality is about what we value. And what we value defines us as beings. Okay, we are partly defined, yes, by cognition, affect, but also by what we value and strive for, by our interests. Okay, and that gives us an identity such that when people challenge us in what we esteem to be our deep values, we feel challenged as organisms, as persons, right? It touches upon the deep beliefs that we hold. That's why people are so disrupted by, ethical problems, because they shake the foundations of who they are. And ethics is really this process of adaptation, of how we can adapt to new, unexpected situations in ways that allow us to maintain flourishing, okay? Maintain a form of thriving, okay? So this is a basic explanation. It will be useful for what comes up, because I'm alluding to this idea that ethics has to do with human flourishing. So when I say this, I do have in mind the ancient Greek and Roman tradition and scholarship, but also the new kind of modern models of eudaimonia, or human flourishing, coming from psychology. And I'm very fond of Carol Riff's work, because it's an integrative model of flourishing that is based partly in psychology literature and philosophy literature, I think it provides, I'm not saying it's the ultimate and only model, but it provides an encompassing understanding of what people consider to be fundamental aspects of being in a state and process or journey of flourishing, because flourishing is often viewed as a state, but it's actually also a process. And Aristotle was very clear about this also. So things like having a purpose in life, having agentivity, being able to be an effective agent in your environment, nurturing positive relationships with others, we know is fundamentally important for human well-being, being in the sense of learning and growth. I like to quote Nelson Mandela after 27 years in jail, unfairly, states that, he never loses. Either he wins or he learns. So always being in a state of learning, even from challenges. Although this is pretty much the extreme. Having autonomy, I think, doesn't need any explanation for this crowd, and accepting oneself, which is really important for the people I work with, which are children and adults with chronic conditions who struggle a lot, who live with rare conditions. This is a huge life struggle for them to accept their condition and entertain a positive account of who they are and what they contribute to others. And it is possible, although I'm not saying that we need to fall ill to become flourishing human beings. And actually, Aristotle was also quite clear on this. That people that say that you have to be sick and poor to be flourishing are speaking nonsense. Aristotle said that actually you can actually flourish in those conditions, but no one would want this. And I want to also kind of pay tribute to the fact that, in Canada, we are on Indigenous lands, and we are coming to grapple with the fact that these traditions are also traditions of scholarship, that they have contributed to modern ideas. And I'll spare you a parenthesis about the impact of the encounter of the French Jesuits with some of the first nations of Quebec on the impact of the French Enlightenment, because it actually provided a model of a free society at a time where France was ruled by Louis XIII and XIV. So there are deep scholarly contributions of these traditions that are I think they need to be excavated and appreciated. But what I wanted to make is that there's an interesting parallel of what's coming out of the Quebec and Labrador First Nations account of well-being, which they call mieux-être or better being, acknowledging that this is a process, something you aim to. It's not something you necessarily can claim to be in, forever at a certain time, but something that you're on a trajectory towards. And there are many parallels, I'll spare you the details, that we can kind of make sense across really different traditions and their valued aspects of human life. One thing that is really different is the importance of land, connection to land. But then again, we could say, oh, in the Western tradition, we have things from like Aldo Leopold's land ethics. So there are kind of communicating vessels between those traditions and things we can learn from each other. But I'm saying this also because I think, in a sense, ethics goes further than these accounts of human flourishing. I think that I don't want to discredit them, because I think they are really valuable in thinking about what is important to us. But at the same time, ethics is an empowerment, an encouragement to live a life that is consistent with our own values, to know ourselves and to live a life that fulfills the goals we aspire to, or basically not to make of human life something that we're subjected to, but something that is a project. And I think here that really imagination plays a really fundamental role in this account of ethics. And I certainly acknowledge that this account of ethics maybe is not a dominant account of ethics, that this is something perhaps controversial, but at least within this mind frame, imagination plays a key role. And here again, there's an interesting link to the pragmatist tradition, and it's no secret that I'm a big fan of pragmatism. But John Dewey himself, pulling from the early utilitarians, used this dramatic terminology to talk about ethics as deliberation and as a dramatic rehearsal of possibilities. So imagination plays a role to simulate what the outcomes of different lines of acts or courses of action would look like. So imagination in this tradition, which I'm also very influenced by, imagination is already acknowledged like 100 years ago, as playing a really important role. There are many other insights in Dewey, the system 1, the system 2, stuff about habits and intelligence and inquiry. Really look up this scholarship. I think it's really underappreciated. Another thing that I pull from the pragmatist, as well as some of the contemporary scholarship, and that gets into this distinction between morality and ethics, and that is important for thinking about the role of imagination, is that really morality relies, in a sense, on mechanisms of memory. So what we do now and what we have done is really the past and current. And ethics is about the future. So when people criticize ethics for being speculative, and say, no, ethics is about thinking about the future. You know, intelligence is about adaptation to new circumstances. So if ethics is at all form of intelligent inquiry, it is going to be about future events and scenarios. And for me, this structure allows to kind of dismantle a very famous distinction we have in philosophical ethics between the is and the ought, which I would reframe as a tension between the past and current, what we know and what we have experienced, what we experience, and what we aspire to, the ought. So for pragmatists, this is not only a distinction in discourse, it's a distinction between states of existence, the past and the future, and how we reconcile that. I think ethics has an important role, and I'll come back to this in a minute. So furthermore, what we know and have experience of is experience in the form of situations, okay? And so when we project that to the future, we talk about scenarios, okay? So the future we can envision through scenarios. The past we experience, we recall through episodic memory of situations. So episodic memory is structured around basically concepts of who's involved in a situation, what happened, when, and so on. And likewise, for this account of ethical imagination and deliberation, scenarios can be useful holistic units to think about how we imagine the projection of events, of lived events. Now, interestingly, this was already envisioned by William James and John Dewey, who spoke a lot about narrative identity and the reconciliation of the past and present and the role of imagination. And there's current work that, if you're interested, that describes the prospective brain and makes these interesting linkages between episodic memory and imagination, as well as conditions that affect episodic memory, forms of dementia, for example, and future-oriented thinking, as well as conditions that affect planning and future-oriented thinking, like ADHD, and its impact on memory. So basically, the idea that's coming up is that these are communicating vessels, memory and imagination. And in the account of ethics that I'm developing, basically, ethics plays a really important role in reconciling us in the form of our past and current with our future, okay, in a way that allows us to build and maintain an identity and integrity as a person or organism in a process of reconciling past current experience with projections of the future and our aspirations for self-actualization, okay? So I hope you agree with me, and if not, I'm in deep trouble. So the last point here is that the exercise of imagination is really a political social exercise. And we know from all kinds of minority rights movement, disability rights, linguistic rights, feminism, and so on. We know that it is, we've come to recognize, fortunately, that it is increasingly difficult to talk meaningfully about the well-being and what the good life of a person is without engaging them and asking them how they feel and think, right? And I think even perhaps more useful is Janazoff's concept of socio-technological imaginaries that kind of bridges this role of imagination and the politics of technology and science together. Now, I guess the question for us, and I don't want to bring up, is what and whose imagination is being mobilized in the debates we have about technology? Because I think imagination does play an important role. But whose is it? And can we open up imaginations of flourishing and better being by asking questions about why we're addressing such and such issues with technology, who's involved, what's at stake, when are we, going to be meaningfully tackling those issues, for whom and with whom, and so on. So basically, just the last few words on imagination and neurotechnology in the context of neuroethics. So basically, based on the neuroethics experience and other experiences, so please share your experiences in dealing with and developing scholarship with respect to different technologies. But based on this experience and the proposed connection between ethics, flourishing, and imagination, what can we learn about or propose to build an ethics or neuroethics? I want to kind of open up the space because I find we don't very often ask these questions about how we imagine our fields, sociology, ethics, philosophy, and what questions we could be asking in the spirit of expanding our imaginations to create more inclusive futures or fairer futures, if I bow to Ian's talk yesterday. So the question could be, why is technology worthy of attention? Because of biomedical science, media reports, real-world impact, speculation. What are the ethical questions that the technology raises? According to which account of ethics? Because I'm asking this question because I observe that sometimes we ask questions from a view from nowhere, to basically refer to Thomas Nagel. We ask questions about the ethics of technology as if technology raises ethical questions. And I'd say we need to step back and maybe realize that those technologies pose questions for people and societies, and to really pay attention to these aspects and to who's involved or which account of ethics we are using to undergird these discussions. For whom does the technology raise questions? Lab scientists, whose perspective, is included, excluded, whose imagination is being nurtured by how we talk about the technology? Who's involved? Another important question, I think. When should we start talking about this? There's been quite a bit of debate about how neuroethicists may have been kind of, be somehow complicit of promoting a technological agenda by buying to or replicating claims about technology which should be kind of critically assessed. And I do want to acknowledge, I think we had examples of this yesterday, or some of our colleagues, bringing attention to the scientific evidence regarding new forms of cognitive enhancers. Where does the technology raise ethical questions? In which countries, in which settings, for which groups, which circles, which public spheres? just kind of recognizing, that to some extent, the American bioethics has almost been evolving into two different public spheres. And because of social media, people listening to themselves quite a bit. Academic bioethicists have not really been paying attention to kind of the religious-based neoconservative bioethicists that has been brewing up, being funded by billionaire investors and so on. So, which public spheres? And maybe most importantly, towards which goals, or within which worldview, and towards what kind of future? So, as Seb was mentioning, these kinds of questions have been leading my group, myself, my colleagues, to move towards a form of living ethics. And this is it's not a concept, it's not a theory, it's a stance. That's how we describe this idea. It's a stance or mind frame that tries to reconnect ethics to goals of human flourishing and sustainable human development through methods such as dialogue, co-learning methods, and different important concepts such as inclusion and imagination. It's trying to move with, but also beyond disciplinary, national, and cultural linguistic frontiers. And a question in the context of neuroscience would be, what can neuroscience contribute to a form of living ethics? And in practice, this is leading my group to develop forms of ethics intervention using different forms of living labs or participatory research, different efforts to test out and develop co-creative methods with different groups. We have worked with youth who have chronic conditions, and we're engaging them in thinking about transition care in a way that maps to their account of human flourishing. And you can imagine a teenager living with a severe chronic illness, not seeing goals as like independence or autonomy as being, the ultimate goals, because they're probably out of reach. So if we overemphasize these goals to these groups, these people, we actually undermine their ability to accept who they are, because we're telling them you should be independent, you should be autonomous. Well, this is not something that's possible for me. So how do you prepare me for life, and for adult healthcare? So these are the kinds of things we're working on, and I'll spare, if you're interested, I'll tell you more about our current research. What I want to do now is conclude, and thank you for your attention in advance. So what I tried to argue is ethics is a form of intelligence, of inquiry-based process that aims at human flourishing and therefore mobilizes imaginative abilities. These abilities have often been constrained, leading to restricted human experiences. I guess that's the important point I didn't say, is that when we imagine societies in ways that exclude people, we prevent people from living full life experiences. And I think that's a fundamental harm. Okay. Now, neuroethics, especially imagined as an ethics of neurotechnology, offers a specific backdrop, an influential backdrop for discussions about cognitive enhancement. Imaginations of well-being have potentially been polarized in this context. This leads to asking questions about which experiences and imaginations are reflected in current discussions on cognitive enhancement and other neurotechnologies. And I'm inviting you to kind of engage in what we can learn about what we've done, not to simply kind of turn our backs on the past, but how we can do better looking forward and engaging perhaps in deeper ways with ideas such as human flourishing and the ability to foster more inclusive imaginations of the future. So thank you very much for your attention.